Or we're going to give it maybe another minute and then we'll get started.
Okay, I think we'll go ahead and kick things off. So, good afternoon or morning. As Michelle had said, thank you guys for joining us today. I'm going to kick us off with introductions. I'm Kari Kelly, a director. I've been with Huron for 19 years. My expertise lie in costing related research services, in addition to indirect cost rate development services. Throughout my career, I've had the opportunity to work with multiple institutions on the strategy, development, and implementation of cost-based animal per diem rates.
Hey everyone, my name is Neil Villani and I'm a manager at Huron Consulting Group 2. I've had over 6 years of experience in kind of research administration, primarily focusing on those cost recovery services like Kari was mentioning as well. Over the past couple of years, I've had the opportunity to work with multiple animal centers on their operations, per diem rates, and all other kind of sort of endeavors.
Yep. And hi, everyone. My name is Michelle Chardon. I am a senior associate with Huron Consulting Group in the costing practice as well. I've been in higher ed around 17 years, with about 15 of those years at an institution and 2 of those now in consulting. I have worn lots of hats at the institution level. I had a large focus on service center rate calculations, including the animal per diem rates from the institution side, and I have helped several institutions as well on the consulting side calculate their rates as well. So thank you all for joining today.
Okay, so a few housekeeping tips. All participants are muted currently throughout the meeting. Please minimize any other operation or software that may impact the quality of the meeting on your computer. And throughout the presentation, please feel free to submit any questions via the chat function. We do have some polling questions. They are anonymous, so just a little bit of participation throughout the webinar this afternoon. And then we are recording the meeting session. It'll be available to everybody after the webinar. And in terms of the questions, what we will do is we are allotted some time at the end of the presentation. So that's when we will be answering questions. And if for some reason the time doesn't allow for us to get to all of them, we will see who the question came from and ensure that we will reach out following the webinar with an answer to that question. So a brief overview of the agenda this afternoon. Well, I'm going to go over the animal per diem rate, but just in general, and a recap of the webinar we presented last spring. And then Michelle's going to take it over and walk you through an overview of a per diem rate calculation model and kind of the data that's required to complete the calculation and analysis. And then the time and motion study, which is a really important piece of the calculation. And then Neil's going to take it over and talk through the rate calculation considerations, communication and implementation plans of the per diem rates. And then I'm going to wrap it up with just the utilization of, how to use this information operationally, the outcomes of the per diem rate calculation. I think we have a quick polling question here. I think we want to do the first one. There we go. Okay. When was the last time you have calculated or recalculated per diem rates? This is just helpful for us to kind of get a feel for where everybody sits within this process. Okay. So it looks like over half of the attendees have gone through a calculation within the last year or two, which is great to see. And then we kind of go from, 3 to 5 years, some never, or you're not sure. So this is all great to know. So thank you for participating in the polling question. So for anyone who joined us for the webinar last spring, um, or any new attendees, the goal of this afternoon is really to take a deeper dive into the animal per diem rate calculation. In addition to the development of cost-based rates, we will discuss the detail, the data requirements, the various tools that can be used for the calculation, and as I mentioned, additional advantages that an institution will gain by investing in this calculation. So at a high level, what is an animal per diem rate? It is the cost to care for an animal or cage of animals for a single day. And this can vary from one institution to another. It is defined under what we call the standard of care. And when it comes to animal per diem rates, the standard of care typically refers to the level of care and services provided to ensure the well-being of the animals. So this is inclusive of husbandry services, veterinary care, which can be routine checkups or medical treatments, facility maintenance, ensuring that the housing and environments are clean and safe and conducive for the animal's health. And then also, and most importantly, compliance with regulations, adhering to guidelines and standards set by bodies like NIH and USDA. These standards are helpful for institutions to justify their per diem rates by demonstrating that you are providing comprehensive and high quality care to the animals. And in turn can also then, form a business case for things like subsidies and such that are necessary to maintain these standards. So the standard of care, as I mentioned, it's defined within their institution by the services that are inclusive in that per diem rate and have a significant impact on the cost of care. So, the per diem rate calculation is going to be inclusive of some of the things I just mentioned. And then there may be services that you're billing for in addition to a per diem rate that can be related to technical services or direct billing of supplies for certain procedures that are above and beyond what you would classify within that standard of care. So the governing regulations and guidelines, they're very important. Here you can see the OMB uniform guidance. This regulation is going to establish uniform administrative requirements and cost principles, especially when you're charging federal projects. You want to ensure that you are, charging cost-based rates. You have a calculation or backup to justify the rates that are being charged. The NIH cost analysis rate setting, or also known as the CARS manual, is a guide that really outlays the approach you should take to an animal per diem rate calculation. It lays out the different steps and pieces surrounding the time and motion study, cost allocation, and assignments. And then institutionally, what policies does your institution have in place for costing and rate setting? Is this adhering for, your recharge or service center activities? What other institutional policies to ensure that your rates are compliant with all of the above? So we will dive into all of these topics in depth this afternoon. But the goal of analyzing per diem rates on an annual basis, really overall, and you'll see this theme throughout the afternoon, it's really going to provide greater transparency into the overall per diem rate being charged. So that expense allocation, the study is going to really align the specific expenditures and salary related costs and all costs that go into housing and caring and allowing the research to take place with various species and really aligning those costs with the specific species that are benefiting from those activities. It's also going to allow transparency into what's the true cost of your operation. And do you have a subsidy? What is that amount? Which rates are being subsidized? Does this justify an increase in your subsidy? And for research allocation, the time and motion study really does allow, even though that's not the goal of it, it's creating an allocation statistic, and we'll talk more about that, but it does give you some visibility into the duration of, common daily activities and staffing purposes, FTEs, and how that might stack up to another institution, and in some instances, the efficiency of the various levels of staff. So really overall understanding where the dollars recovered by a species originates is really going to also allow that accurate budgeting and will help in future planning. So as a closing point to this section, and again, just keeping it very high level, there's a lot of transparency that comes through the costing exercise of going through the animal per diem rate. We'll talk through the different data points. What's that definition of care, and what are those guidelines, and making sure that you're aware of what they are, and that as you go through and complete your calculation, that you're being mindful and compliant of those. And then the transparency of just the users on campus, and what kind of costs are making up those rates. And I'm sure a lot of you can align with knowing that the true rate that you are calculating might also not be what you're able to charge. And we'll talk a lot about that, and that transparency and showing that really the true cost of these services being provided may actually be a lot higher than what is actually being charged and recovered to date.
We have another poll question for you all as well. What methodology, or what was the methodology you used for your most recent per diem rate calculation? Thank you all for answering. This is a great response. All right. So it looks like we kind of have a mixture here of things. Flat percentage increases, that's fairly common as well. Of course, we're happy to see the model calculation is a higher percentage because that's what we want to see, the cost-based kind of analysis. So yeah, thank you all for sharing. All right, so I am going to take over for a little bit. Give me just a second. And I'm sorry if I start coughing. I've been a little under the weather, so I will do my best to not cough too much. But I really wanted to start with a quick high level kind of walkthrough of what the model would look like if you were to do a cost-based model. And we have 8 steps here. The first thing that you're going to want to start with is gathering up a full year of your full fiscal year of your costs. So think, like your personnel cost, your operating cost, your details of your bedding, feed, enrichment cost. If you have access to, your indirect costs, like your utilities or, cage watch space, sometimes I know this is done in, the spring timeframe, so you may have like 9 months of data to calculate your new year rates. But as long as you have enough to like make a solid estimate, having a full year is the best, but as long as you can make an estimate. So the first thing you're going to do is gather up all your costs, and then you're going to start dividing up your cost into groups, right? Is it a support cost, or is it direct to the species costs? Is it general admin time? There's lots of different groups, and we're going to go through those in the next few slides as well. And then after you've kind of grouped your costs, you can start assigning those costs to the different activity codes. We call them activity codes or cost centers, and they're going to be like your major functions in your facility. So your animal husbandry, your general admin, your cage wash, those are just some of the examples. So you're going to start assigning those costs to those different groups. The other piece, and you'll hear this over and over again, that your salary and wages are typically your largest expense. anywhere from 70 to 80% of your costs are for salary and wages. And the time and motion study, we're going to do a deep dive of the time and motion study here in a few minutes, but being able to create a statistic that is based in time and motion data will give you a really good result for those salary and wage costs. So once you've done your time and motion study, then you're going to start allocating those costs down to your activities. You know, which of your costs are for animal husbandry and which of your costs are for animal health care or cage wash. And then once you have it kind of in those main functions, you're going to allocate your costs one step further down to each species, because that's our goal, right? Is to get our costs into our activities and then to each species. So that way you can have your kind of numerator in that formula for calculating your per diem rate. So what's your true cost for this species, for each of your species? And then to develop your denominator, you're going to use your animal census data. So animal care days, a typical piece of data that we use, and it's annualized over the year. So for, say, one of your populations, how many animal care days did that take? So you take your total cost divided by the animal care days, and that's how you calculate your per diem rate. That was a very brief, very high level, and now we're going to go through some of those details. So thinking first about your direct costs and your support costs and coming up with, you know, those, we'll call them cost centers here today. Those activities, those functions that your facility uses, you know, we typically start by thinking of them in two different groups. So you have your direct cost centers, and those are going to be your things that are for your husbandry of your animals and are directly assignable to, you know, a specific either species or, you know, directly assignable to animal husbandry and should be part of your per diem rate. And then you have your support cost centers, and those are going to be your costs that are part of your animal facility. They're part of your cost and should be in the per diem rate, but they may not be specifically identifiable to, you know, a direct species. And there's several different ways that we can get those costs assigned to the species. So that's our first pass. You know, we think about what's our direct cost versus what's in our support cost centers. There's, you know, these are going to be facility specific. And we have some common cost centers. There's actually 2 pages of these. This is just the first one. So some of the common kind of groupings of costs that we see, just starting here, and these are brief definitions, and you'll want to think about, you know, your facility specifically and how you want to group those costs. And after you do this a few times, you may find, oh, I don't need all of these different groups. We can put these together because, you know, you're not really finding a difference by having separate groups. But typically we see like animal health care, animal husbandry, cage wash, enrichment. Sometimes the biosecurity is by itself. And then also facility management may or may not be something that you want to track separately, but it is something that we see commonly as a group of costs. Let's see the next slide. General admin is also a common support cost center. It is, I'd say every facility is going to have general admin, and surprisingly, one of the things that we see with the time and motion study, and I'll show you in a little while, is that the general admin costs typically make up a pretty significant chunk of your overall operating costs. So it's interesting to see, you know, how much of your actual facility costs are made up of general admin costs. So that's kind of your grouping, you know, of everything that's administrative, but that you would include in your per diem rate. I did want to point out IACUC and technical services on this one. So typically IACUC, we do accumulate the cost. So if you have IACUC related activities happening or supporting, excuse me, we do accumulate those costs, but they typically get excluded from your rate calculation because the cost for IACUC is already being picked up through your IDC rate calculation. But we do want to identify those costs. You do want to know how much that's charging you so you can exclude that because it's already being covered in your IDC rate. And then technical services typically would be your direct build, or like Kari was saying earlier, your surgery costs, those things that are being passed through directly to your end users that are not part of your per diem rate. So that's where you would kind of gather up all those costs so you could exclude them from your other from the rate calculation, because you don't want to, if they're being direct billed to grants already or other cost centers, you don't want to roll them into your per diem rates. Transportation is another cost that you can add in, and then also direct to species. The more you can assign your costs directly to a species, the better outcome you will have in getting that true cost of each species, right? Because if you can say, we know this bedding and feed is for X species, then that cost is going to be more accurate instead of using allocation methods. So the more you can identify directly to a species, the better. So let's talk just a second about, once you kind of have your costs bucketed into those different groups, how do you allocate those? So there's several different methods that you can use. Like I was just talking about, the direct assignment to species is obviously the best way. If you can identify costs directly to species, then that's the way to go. But we realize that, something like general admin time, there's no way to do that. Or even your salary and wages directly to species. So we have to use these allocation statistics. So we use animal care days or census data, total assigned cost for general admin, and then the time and motion study is what gets used to allocate your salary and wage costs. And so once you've done all that, the formula kind of looks like this, right? You have your indirect animal cost, your direct animal cost. Well, let's just say for this example, for ease, it was $10,000 for this one species. And the same species had 10,000 animal care days. So the per diem rate for that species, the full cost is $1. So that's the high level, easiest example possible. I doubt anyone will have $10,000 in cost and 10,000 animal care days and $1 per diem rate, but just for ease. All right, excuse me. Let's talk about the data. Okay, so I've told you a lot about everything that you need to do to calculate a per diem rate, but what kind of data are you going to need to gather all the costs and make all those allocations and make some other determinations? So we really think about data in 3 different buckets. So your financial data, I said before, you want your full fiscal year of financial data, and then your allocation data is going to be made up of things like your census, your time and motion study statistics, and that's what's going to give us the ability to kind of assign those costs down to each species. And then the third part is the organizational data. And so organizational data is going to be, everything that kind of helps you determine, what is your standard of care, what is how transparent are you being with your customers, and your organizational charts, who should be part of the per diem rate, who's truly in administration or in a veterinary role that's not part of the rate calculation. There's a lot of organizational data that you can gather to kind of help you assign those costs and make those determinations. So let's look a little bit more at financial data and some of the things that you want to consider. So we briefly touched on this, but I think a good place to start for you is look at your current per diem rates and how have you done the calculation before? You know, are there changes that you want to make in the next rate calculation? Or you have new species coming on? You know, what do you need to do to be prepared for the next rate calculation? Based on what you're learning here today and what you already know, are you at risk for any compliance issues in your previous rate calculations? And do you want to make changes, you know, to the way you're either doing the rate calculation or your current rates? Are you planning on implementing increases in the future? Do you want to decrease your subsidy? You know, all those things, just kind of start with a plan, right? And then the other pieces of data that you want are your revenue and expenses for your fiscal year. Um, it's good to start at a high level look at, you know, your revenue versus your expenses so you can kind of judge, you know, what's your subsidy looking like? Are your expenses way over what you've been billing? Is there a timing issue with your billing? You know, are you months behind on billing? And, you know, so where's that difference? So just kind of getting an understanding of how your revenue is working with your expenses. And then the two key pieces of data that you're going to need to do the actual rate calculation are your payroll. So a list of everyone's salaries and wages by employee and job title. And the reason we need job title, you'll see later with the time and motion study, why you would want job title is because the stats get kind of rolled up at the position level. So you want everyone's payroll, that should be part of the per diem rate calculation. One thing that you can think about is your future planned staffing as well. Do you have vacant positions that you are openly, you know, recruiting for? Those could also be included if, you know, there's a definite plan and you will fill them and it will be part of your rates. So I think you can definitely include um, vacancies that you know will be a real expense in your upcoming rate calculation. The other thing you're going to need is all of your operating accounts charges. And the more detailed, the better, because you're really going to have to dig in and see if you can find any of those species level expenses or identify what is bedding and what is feed and what is enrichment costs and start, you know, bucketing those costs into those different groups of animal husbandry and animal healthcare, cage wash, that kind of thing. And so really the things to consider is your data detailed enough to assign costs like that? Um, Another key thing that you want to do is can you identify the difference between those pass-through costs versus, you know, the cost that should be going into your per diem rate? Are you tracking that? Because you don't want to include anything that you're already billing to the federal government or passing on to grants already into your per diem rate calculation. And do you have enough data to remove unallowable costs that don't support, you know, the standard of care? So briefly thinking about allocation data, your animal census, um, you want to have a unit for each of your species. You know, is it a cage? Is it per animal? Is it a family unit, tank? You know, I'm sure you guys have a unit already that you're billing by. So that same unit that you would be billing by is what you're going to have your census data on. That's going to become the kind of denominator of your calculation. Are there, for the year you're looking at, are there any, you know, odd things that happen during the year that you wouldn't want to represent in your per diem rate? And should you make an adjustment for that? And, you know, if you have a new species coming on, can you use one of the species that you already have, kind of as a proxy for that new species? The time and motion study, we're going to cover it in detail in just a minute. And then square footage of the facility. So if you wanting to do a full cost analysis and include those kind of indirect costs, you know, understanding your space is going to be important. Organizational data. again, your policies and procedures, you know, is it clear what your standard of care is and what should be included in your rate? Your org chart, is it clear, you know, who should be, do you have a full understanding of who should be in your per diem rate calculation and who should not be? If you've been, you know, sometimes the cost-based model comes up if you've been through an audit. So if you have, you want to make sure that you're addressing all those compliance issues, operational forms and user guides. And that's more about being able to, again, determining what is part of your per diem versus what is your technical services and being billed directly. And do your users understand that? And can you divide your cost up that way? So that was a lot on data requests. I'm gonna take a breather for a second before we move on to time and motion study. So let's do a poll question. When was your last time and motion study conducted? Awesome. Thank you all. This is great. I mean, I'm seeing 31% of you this year. All right, so you're gonna love this topic because I know time and motion study is everyone's favorite thing to talk about and do. But at least a good chunk of you have done a time and motion study. And if you haven't, enjoy the ride because it's a great topic. All right, thank you all. Let me go back. Lost my slides. All right, so time and motion study. Time and motion study tracks labor effort by activity and really by individual and down to the species level. Like I've said before, salaries make up, you know, typically about anywhere from 70 to 80% of your expenditures. And this really is the best way to kind of gauge what people are working on, what activities they're working on, what species they're working with, and kind of create that statistic to allocate those costs down to the specific species. So who does it? Everyone in your animal facility, basically, that is working with animals would be part of the time and motion study. If someone is doing mostly like 100% general administration work, then they can probably sit out. But for the most part, it is everyone in your facility. It is very time intensive. It's about a 2 to 3 week study where people are tracking their time in 15-minute increments for 2 to 3 weeks. But it is part of the recommendation of CARS and a really good way. And there's a lot of good data that comes out of a time and motion study on top of just this stat that we need. So, you know, the key thing is that you want the time and motion study to reflect your normal operations. And so if you could do 3 or 4 weeks, that's will give you even better data. And you know, there's always going to be something that happens during that 2, 3, 4 weeks that causes your data to be skewed. We're going to talk about some of the ways that you can review your data to kind of correct for those anomalies that will kind of, you don't want your data, your time and motion study data, because it's driving such a large portion of your cost to species. You want it to be as accurate as possible. So how do you do a time and motion study? So there's a few ways. We kind of break it down into a traditional full time and motion study or an imputed time and motion study. The traditional full time and motion study is pretty much what I was explaining already, is the 2, 3, 4 week study where you have everyone tracking what they're doing, what activities, what species they're working with for in 15-minute increments. It is time intensive for your staff. There's a couple of ways to do it. The old way was everyone had a piece of paper and they would just literally write out their day as they were going. Lately, there's been an uptake of using online forms, even on mobile devices, to kind of do the same process that you were doing on paper, but kind of gathering that data um, electronically ahead of time. Because once it was done on paper, somebody had to go take all that paper and translate it into an Excel spreadsheet to develop stats. So very time intensive to do it with paper. Excuse me. The other option, if a full time emotion study is really out of, you just can't squeeze it in, or maybe you did one last year and things haven't changed that much. You can use imputed hours. So typically what it is leadership or a supervisor or someone like that will go in and say, this is what I know my staff are working on, what activities they're working on, and this is what species they're working on. So you kind of make your best guess, if you will, your best estimate of how the facilities are operating. It doesn't take as much time to complete, but again, it's not as accurate because you don't have the individuals on the floor doing the work, logging their time. So, oh, let's see. Another poll question. In your last calculation, what type of time emotion study did you conduct? All right. Seems like over half of you have done a traditional full time emotion study. Some of you are imputing hours. These are both perfectly acceptable methods. It's just, what level of data do you want and how much scrubbing you might have to do to get it kind of accurate in the end. Thank you all for participating. All right. All right, so I just wanted to show you some examples of what the different forms kind of look like. This is an example of a paper form, and you can see just has time blocks, right? And so somebody would literally say, I was working on general admin and I was working on birds, for this amount of time. You can also log the facility because that could give you another data point that you could use. But yeah, so you would have everyone fill one of these out every day, and then someone would go in, or someone has to go in and enter this data into a spreadsheet. The other thing that we're seeing more common now, or it's the same concept, same everything, is using a mobile form to kind of do the same process of logging, what activity and what species are you working on. Especially if you, have institutional phones, they're on the floor, they can do it in real time. So this is another option that you can use to complete the same process. And then here's kind of an example of an imputed hours where there was a time emotion study done a few years back. And then, so there were kind of old time emotion stats, and then the updates in the kind of yellowish color of what they think this animal care technician, what they're spending their time on, and then what species they're working on. Okay, so let's say you've gathered all this data, right? You have thousands of rows of minutes of time worked. What do you do with all that? And, what is it even for? Once that data has been gathered, the first step that you're going to do is kind of aggregate it by position. So you're going to take all those minutes, and let's just look at this one horizontally, like an animal care tech, for example. You can see 76.7% of their time was spent doing animal husbandry. So for all your animal care techs, 76.7% of their salary and wages is going to go into that bucket for animal husbandry. And so that's the first pass, right? You get all these stats from all those minutes that they've logged into these kind of groups. And then the next step is to look at that time by species, right? So you do this one vertically. So if you look at that animal husbandry column again, and think about, that 76% that that animal care tech had worked on, you would take that 76% of their salary and wages, and then that would get divided up, 10% to mouse barrier, 67 to mouse conventional. That's how it works. So first you do to position, and then you get it to your species level, and the costs just end up going to each individual species for each position. I have another look view of this to kind of really make sure you guys are getting what I'm saying here. So for example, if you have this animal facility staff person, right, who makes $30,000 a year, and through the time and motion study, it came out that this person's cage wash was 90%, right? That 90% of their time is doing cage wash and 10% is doing general admin. So 27,000 of their salary of their $30,000 will go to cage wash, and then 3,000 will go to general admin. And then at the species level, that $27,000 that's for cage wash is going to get split 40-60 between mice and rats. So that's kind of how it all flows through, and gathering all that data and then doing it at position and species really gets your salary and wage costs down to each of your species. General admin, we say all species. And then that all species kind of gets spread based on total cost to all the other species. So lots of different statistics and allocations happening, but this is the most simplified way for you to see how the data is flowing down to each species. All right, so data scrubbing. There's going to be human error. There's going to be, data that doesn't make sense in your time and motion study results. You're going to be like, why is this person working on this species? I had no idea. And so that's either going to ask you the question of, is that person really working on that species, or was there something special happening? Were they filling in? So the first thing you're going to look at is the position level data validity. You're going to look at the percentages by each position to ensure those activities align with your expectations. And is it representative of your normal activity? If you're going to use this to create your rates, you want to make sure, that the position level data represents what you expect, and there wasn't anything weird or something that happened during the time frame of the time and motion study that's skewing your data. Same thing for species. You're going to look at the percentages by species and make sure that that aligns with your expectations. I've seen lots of different things. Was there a sick animal maybe during your time and motion study? And so people were spending a lot more time taking care of that species than they normally would. I've seen elevators go down, so transportation costs, the time to transport animals was increased. There's lots of different things that can happen that you want to make sure you're aware of and fix, because again, it's going to drive your cost to those species. So it's really important that you take the time and go through the data to make sure it really represents your normal activities. Okay. So we talk a lot about, it's for the salary and wage stat, but here's just an example of some of the other data outputs that you could pull from this data. You can, use this to look at your percent of your total time spent by species. So you could do this by position, where are all my staff spending their time, right? Which species are they working on? What activities are they working on? And this example, you can see the general admin time was 59%, does that make sense? Or is that going to be shocking? Or can you plan ahead using that kind of data? And then, or this third example is, who's working on animal husbandry? You can see, is it my animal lab techs? Why are my clinical veterinarians working on animal husbandry? So there's a lot of data in here that you can pull out to just kind of inform yourself, of who's working on what. The possibilities are endless, honestly. Um, Again, the primary purpose is to develop that stat. It really is not meant to be a performance kind of review. But if you're spending the time to gather that much data for 3-4 weeks, um, I encourage you to use it to, like look at your effort by activity or your effort by species, and really use that to make some informed decisions. There's a lot of data there that you've gathered, so you can utilize it. Okay, so I've talked a lot. I'm sure you guys are tired of my voice. So I'm going to turn it over to Neil for a little while. Thank you.
Thanks, Michelle. So now we're going to go through the rate calculation considerations. And so I'm going to start off with just briefly going over, we've discussed the data request, we've discussed the type of expenses and the time and motion study. So I want to jump into the rate components, making up the calculation at a high level. So we start with those operating expenses, salaries, fringe, your feed, your bedding, all of those things that Michelle was talking about. And then after that point, we assign them to our activity codes. So we take all of your operating expenses and push them into our different buckets: husbandry, healthcare, cage washing, GA, all of those items. After that point, we allocate those buckets into some sort of allocation statistic to those individual animal species. And then we divide those costs by your care days. And this leads to the calculated per diem rates. What isn't really shown here, that Michelle covered briefly, were those exclusions. So we do exclude those like iCook expenses and any other expenses recovered through other means. So for example, with iCook, a lot of those are recovered through what we call the IDC or F&A proposal. So this is your indirect cost rate proposal, or facilities and administration, it's sometimes called as well. And that's really intended to reimburse the institution for those indirect costs associated with sponsored research. So that covers the iCook expenses. But if you also have expenses that you are directly charging to PIs or your users, then we can't include those in the per diem rates. So in general, costs which are recovered through other means, you don't want to double count them. You want to only include costs that you are not recovering. So there are, so out of those like operating expenses, I wanted to call out a few special considerations, starting with your feed, your bedding, and your enrichment. Outside of that ocean study, this is like one really core focus point. So typically in your trial balance or your financials, these expenses are captured at a lump sum level. Sometimes I've seen where there's 12 lines for feed, one for every month. That's just represented in your financials. So if we just took that and allocated those based on the animal care days, we could be under allocating costs to those larger animal species or species that require very specific or specialized diets. So if your animal center, just as an example, is 95% mice and rats, if we were to allocate feed by animal care days, it's going to go 95% to mice and rats. That might not represent some of your larger animals who could eat different diets, could eat more, all of those types of things. You might have to, those might cost more than just the rat and mice feed. So the goal is to allocate these costs to those individual species and not just use a standard like by your animal care days. So there's a couple of ways that we can transform that initial financial data. If your financial system does have a specific tracking attribute that does, tell you this feed was for this animal species, that's amazing, but we don't always see that. A lot of times you have to go down the vendor level. If you have a list of all the vendors that you've used for feed, for example, and you have the total dollars you've spent, you can say, okay, this vendor was specifically used for mice. This vendor was specifically used for primates. This vendor was specifically used for rabbits. You could do something like that. If a vendor is for multiple species, you can try and think of a way that you can allocate those costs to those individual species. Maybe their animal care days could be appropriate. But you do want to kind of break it down to those vendor levels. The other option, which is a little bit more time consuming, is by purchase orders. It is going to be the most accurate. Like I said, if you go and dig through all of your purchase orders for the entire fiscal year, it's going to take a lot of time and effort, and it might not be worth all that time and effort going down to that granular level. But there are cases where vendor might not work. So, for example, you buy all of your enrichment items from Amazon, right? So going through each PO is going to be very, very time consuming. So maybe you sort it by your higher dollar items, go through those particular POs and carve out those costs and assign them directly to the animals they benefit. And then you think about, are there any animals that you did not buy any enrichment for during that fiscal year? Or if that enrichment was part of the caging or part of some other costs, then you might not need to consider those when you're looking at the remainder of those enrichment expenses. So there are ways that you can kind of merge those two methodologies together. But ideally, what you want to do for your feed, your bedding, and enrichment purchases is to track which animals they benefit throughout the year. So you don't have to do it in your financial system, but having some sort of shadow Excel or shadow system is really helpful. And it'll help you kind of determine, okay, how much do we how much feed does this particular animal take? How much bedding does this animal take? It really just helps in your general operations too. So having this level of data is helpful for more than just the animal per diem rate calculation. The direct to species expense. So I mentioned this briefly when talking about that enrichment example, and Michelle also kind of covered it. If you're able to identify cost to those individual species, then carving those out of your expenses and assigning them directly is the best way to do it. So this allows for a more accurate expense by species. You gather so much data when calculating your animal per diem rates, and you could use this for other purposes. Kari is going to touch upon that in a later section, but you want to make sure that what you're including in the animal per diem rate calculations is as accurate as possible. So if you do use that data for other purposes, you're having accurate data in that case as well. It also helps correct any unusually low or high rates. So let's say, for example, you calculated a really low primate rate, and based on your current rates, it's like $10 less than what you're currently charging. So the first thing I would take a look at is what Michelle talked about, the time and motion study. So thinking through, okay, did I capture all of the time it takes to take care of that animal species? Looking through the people who we captured towards that animal species and saying, is there anyone's time that I am missing? Is it misrepresentative? After that, I would take a look at all the other expenses going to those primates. Did we capture enough feed costs? Did we capture enough bedding costs, enough enrichment costs? Do we have enough animal health care carve-outs and enough general administration? And then after that point, you might say, oh, I didn't capture all of these other expenses. They're kind of being spread out through care days to those other animal species. We might want to carve those out and then push them directly to the animals that they are benefiting. One of the big ones that we always run into is PPE. So there are certain animals that require a lot of PPE, a lot of those BSL-3 lab mice or rats. So, carving out those PPE costs, those increased PPE costs, is helpful when you're calculating a per diem rate because there's not a lot of those BSL-3 mice compared to your standard mice. So if you did it by animal care days, you're going to misrepresent how much it costs to take care of those BSL-3 mice and rats. So I think direct to species is really important to do. So this is just like a really high level of like a result of your calculated rates after you've gone through all the steps that we outlined previously. You basically have your total costs, your animal care days, and those two things divided together gets your calculated rates. And then you kind of want to also see what are your current rates. What rates are higher, what rates are lower. And then this is where you might want to dig down into those each individual activity groups and figure out, okay, has the feed increased throughout the year? Has the bedding increased? Is it appropriately allocated? All of those types of things. So here's a couple of really common occurrences that we've run into through the years, starting with those payroll changes. So when you're including your payroll costs in the model, you're starting with both your salary wage and your fringe benefits. These would represent the hours that your staff has worked throughout the year. It doesn't really account for any vacant positions that you have that you're actively recruiting. So our rule of thumb for vacant positions is if it's being accurately recruited and if it's included in your budgets, then we want to add them into the model. So we would start by adding their projected salary and wage and fringe benefit amounts. And then you also want to estimate the time and motion study. So what will they be working on? Will they be similar to someone else? We might be able to just copy their time and motion study results. We want to make sure that we're capturing the time that they're going to spend on those specific animal species, or if it's just for general administration too. So we want to make sure we include all of that into the model. In addition, if you do have a union, a lot of times there's going to be periodic increases to the salary. So it's important that we account for those as well, since those are going to be guaranteed increases throughout the year. So you really want to take a step back and think about how will the animal center look in that upcoming fiscal year? Are there any payroll changes or confirmations or what's still in the timeline? So let's say you do have someone who's listed as a husbandry staff and they are leaving or they've already left, but then you're actively recruiting for a new position. You want to make sure that you're not double counting those two things, right? You don't want to keep that one person in to the time and motion study and add another vacant position. You want to make sure you do one or the other. So for something like that where people are leaving and you're actively recruiting and adding more people into your animal center, you want to just make sure we're not double counting those costs as well. Speaking of costs, since you do need a full fiscal year to calculate the per diem rates, you're typically utilizing prior year's data while you're sitting in your current fiscal year. So if you are noticing that there's a large increase in, and I really wanted to bold this, the reoccurring operating expenses, you can factor those into the calculation. So for example, if in your current fiscal year, you're changing a vendor and now you have an increase in PPE supplies. Well, you could include that adjustment into your animal per diem rate calculation. That is an expense that's going to be reoccurring, that is going to be increasing for the future. You're using a prior year's data to calculate a rate that you're using in the future, so you want it to be as accurate as possible. If you have an increase of salaries due to an institutional raise, right? Everyone across the board received a 3% increase. We've seen this kind of during the COVID period as well, an increase in those kind of just base salaries. So if you have something like that, we might want to consider that to be an increase or an adjustment into your per diem rates. In general, we like to adjust the expenditures just by a little bit to account for an increase of costs throughout the year. And you want to really think about what's reoccurring. So if you have a one-time caging expense cost that you're not going to have for future years, maybe that's something that you don't include in that per diem rate calculation currently, unless it's going to be reoccurring or that's the new standard through your future years. And then this is a big one that always, always, always comes up is new species coming in. Where again, using prior year, we're using a time and motion study for your current year. You might have species coming in a couple of months that, we just don't have currently, Or when you're doing your time and motion study, maybe a certain species wasn't there for that month. And they do typically, or they are typically there in your animal center. So animal species not present during the time and motion study require kind of like a provisional rate, since you can't really quantify the daily effort required through that time and motion study. So what a provisional rate can be calculated based on is you could use a reasonable cost basis to estimate your per diem rates. You could also say this new species is very similar to a current species that we do have, and then you can account for variations in your time and materials. So, for example, let's say you have a BSL2 mice rate, and now you have BSL3 mice coming in. You could sit down and estimate, okay, these are all the additional time commitments needed by these 3 or 4 people. You can say this is the amount of additional PPE that's needed. These are the additional supplies that we need to buy, and kind of create a mini rate calculation along with the projected animal care days for that species. How long are you going to have them? Are they going to be there for the entire year? Part of the year? What might that look like? And then you could use this kind of mini rate calculation as a stopgap until your next rate cycle. So it's important to recalculate these provisional rates. It's really just a stopgap until your next cycle. So then you do have true cost-based rates for the future. And then lastly, you can utilize benchmarking to understand rates at peer institutions to ensure that rates are competitive. So peer benchmarking is very interesting. So when you do compare your rates, it's not really an apples to apples comparison. You might have a different structure of animal resource program across your peer institution. So your standards of care might be different. Your institution might include disposal costs within your animal per diem rate calculation. However, another institution might bill those costs out directly to the individual PIs. So there's always going to be those differences in standards of care. Same with the subsidy, right? Your institution might decide to subsidize enrichment costs for the entire animal center, but another institution might not do that. So it's important to understand that there is a difference between what's shown on their website or what they might even tell you about as their current rate compared to what did they actually calculate before all the subsidy, before all of their adjustments. So unless you specifically ask for that level of detail or you find that level of detail, it is a little bit difficult to compare rates between your institutions, but you could use it as a gut check to just say, okay, in the stopgap means we might utilize a pure institutional rate, but then in the future, we're going to start tracking our costs and calculate it right out. So these are some challenges when updating your per diem rates. Using outdated rates may just perpetuate the use of rates not calculated and just not using a cost-based methodology. So that could eventually lead to some sort of audit-related issues. Collecting the data can be difficult. With the time and motion study, it could be collected in a paper-based format, like Michelle was talking about, and that is really hard to convert that into Excel. It is labor intensive, and quantifying the subsidy amount is sometimes difficult to do for that species level. So we do have a quick poll question here. How does your institution gather benchmarking data if you do so? Do you contact peer institutions? Do you participate in Yale's kind of national survey? Do you just use the web? Do you just search online and see what's out there? Or is there other means that you do? All right. Could stop it there. Thank you for that information. So it does seem like it is a tie between contacting peer institutions and just looking through on the web. And then those participating in the Yale National Survey and some other means as well. So I think that's really good information just for y'all to see what other people do in your space. Okay, we do have one more question here. What are ways your institution communicates your rate changes? So let's say you do have some rate changes. Do you post it on your website? Do you have a discussion with your PIs and other key stakeholders? Is it just an email blast? Do you just put in your email communication and then they might reach out for any other questions? Or is there some other way? Okay. So it seems like majority of y'all are going through that email communication route, but you're also posting it on the website and some discussions with your PIs and stakeholders as well. So that's really good information too. So this whole section, I kind of wanted to talk about that communication and implementation plan after you do calculate those rates. So communicating with the PIs and the animals staff implementing those rates really does increase your transparency. I really like setting up a meeting with the PIs to kind of show them how the rates have changed and even just showing them the calculated rate versus what, you landed on. Sometimes they don't have that inner detail of how much it truly costs for those animal species and what really goes into those rates. So showing them the calculated rates and the finalized metrics sometimes could be really good. The other recommendation I have along these lines is to clearly outline your standards of care. So having like a living, breathing document that outlines, what tasks are you considered to be a part of your animal per diem rate? What tasks do you consider to be part of that per diem rate calculation for cage washing, for example? Is it once a day, twice a day? Is it once a week, twice a week? What does that look like? So what tasks are covered by the per diem rates and what tasks are you trying to directly bill users for or that are not covered? Having this document is really helpful and it really shows that transparency because someone can then look it up and say, okay, if I did want to have a cage cleaning twice a day, I do now know that I would get billed for that separately. So it just increases that transparency and builds that trust as well. It also helps when you have new species coming in too. You can see exactly what have you covered for similar species, and it creates a stronger provisional rate. So if that new species requires something different, you can then tell the PI that this is what we're already covering, and this is what's going to be a little bit above and beyond. I also like projecting your rates for the next 3 to 5 years as well. You can always caveat the forecast by telling the PIs that it could change based on maybe a change in standards of care or an increase of costs, but this just allows them to budget their animal costs accordingly on their projects. It also gives you a valuable insight on how many years will it take for me to reach my calculated per diem rate. So if you did want to reach your calculated rates faster or sooner, you could increase the projected increases in future years and just give the PIs a heads up. You could say something like, okay, we're going to increase it 5% for the next 2 to 3 years, but then after that, we want to increase it 10% to try and get closer to our calculated rates. It just increases that transparency again and allows them to budget for those future years and for their and put the budget on those research projects for those future years. And this way they can also ask questions and understand what's the true gap between that calculated rate and what you're currently charging me right now. Kari's going to talk about this a little bit more in our next section, but I just wanted to stress that the animal per diem rate calculation process just provides a lot of valuable insights on your operations. Um, you're using a lot of data and digging into a lot of different areas of your animal center. And at a very high level, you can use this data to build a case for a subsidy or an increase to your current subsidy. You can use it to optimize your research and staff allocation. You're going through that time and motion study process. You're understanding what are people working on. So you can gather and summarize that data to use it for optimization purposes. You can enhance your budget planning. Where have your costs increased throughout the years? If they've increased 10% pretty steadily, then maybe you increase that in your budgets or carve out a different portion of it. It could improve the operational efficiency. You can identify areas where resources can be better aligned. All of those things it's just a lot of data, a lot of valuable data when you go through this process. And then lastly, going through and thinking about the future rates and the future rate calculations as well. So if you did do this process for multiple years, you can really get a good deep dive of your expenses and your revenues through the different years. This could help you answer questions like, if you have a current deficit, how has that deficit grown, changed, shifted? Are your revenues reported in a timely manner? How have your expenses grown? Is that what is leading to a deficit, or what specific categories are leading to a greater deficit? During COVID, we saw a lot of like PPE growth or personnel changes, temp agency growth. And then we also noticed like facilities maintenance being pushed off. So after that post-COVID time, we noticed an increase in facilities maintenance costs. So if you have an animal per diem rate calculation, you can kind of see through the years and kind of see where have your expenses and your expenditures changed. So with that, I'm going to hand it off to Kari to talk about your operational utilization of those particular outcomes as well.
Thanks, Neil. So kind of recapping everything we've been talking about this afternoon is going through this exercise when we started. At the beginning, we kind of talked about various goals and different ways to use this information. And so starting with just, what are those factors going into the animal per diem rate calculation? And how can you utilize the data that goes in and the exercise and the calculation outside of just calculating providing cost-based rates. So thinking about the factors, really, you're going to get a great understanding, and we've talked about this in depth, of just what your direct costs are. And those are expenses that are directly related to animal care, feed and bedding. I think anytime you can directly assign an expenditure to a specific species, that's great. And that would be a goal to shoot for. We've worked with institutions where they are tracking at a more granular level. That's not always the case, but when kind of looking at the structure of your operating expenses and how you're recording things, think of, can we add another expense code? Can we break out enrichment from, like feed and bedding, because they're benefiting different species, they're being utilized. How do you, directly get those costs to the species that are benefiting from them? And then you're always going to have those internal support costs or indirect costs, but really having an understanding of what are those costs, and how are you allocating those? And, a lot of these are going to be benefiting your institution as a whole. And that kind of piggybacks onto, I know there was a question on, what does IDC stand for? And that's indirect, cost recovery, or your indirect cost rate, also known as your facilities and administrative rate. And so that's another calculation that's done within your institution. And we've touched upon this throughout the presentation. One of the main things is you also want to make sure you're not duplicating cost recovery with your per diem rate. So you want to understand what costs are being built into your facilities and administrative cost rate. And then what costs are not being picked up there, that are kind of on the table or not being recovered. And those are potential costs that you could be billing into your rates. 9 times out of 10, I'd say, from the calculations that we've done, lots of times what we end up calculating versus what you're actually going to charge your users, there's going to be a gap there for what the market can bear, or that you just can't go ahead and, increase rates by 20, 30%. So, knowing that that's kind of the environment or the climate, but when you're using this information for different things of, asking for an increase in your institutional subsidy, which we'll talk more about, or you're trying to get a new piece of equipment, just really what's that full cost. And so the model that we utilize to calculate, and in any forum that you guys do, you want to make sure that you want to be able to understand what are those institutional costs that support that research that you can pull in that are not getting recovered in your F&A rate proposal. They may jump or skyrocket those rates to a level that you're not able to charge. But then that goes back to, who are the users of your institution? Do you have outside users? Can you charge a higher external user rate and possibly recover some of those? And if the answer to that is no, I think it's still a great data point to have in when you're looking to request additional subsidy or information of that, because these are all true costs for operating and providing the services that you are to the researchers on campus. Species specific needs, just keeping this in mind, and that can vary, and you will see that some species do require more time, they're more labor intensive, or they need specialized environments when you have different things of that nature. And then your species could shift. You can have these one-offs where you may have them 1 year and then not for another 3, and just looking at that information, how to build into it. And then, looking at the census and all of these things come in and go full circle with the benchmarking and stuff as well. Facilities that have larger animal populations, sometimes you can see them achieve a lower per diem rate because they have a higher census to kind of spread those costs. It is basic math when you look at, you're taking all those costs and then dividing it by the number of species. And there's some static costs that no matter how big or small your institution is, they're still going to be there. They're static. You're still going to need the general admin. You're still going to have some of those. And so that's just, all of that would come through this exercise to really understand that. And then if somebody comes to say, oh, your guys' rates are so high, or maybe you're realizing your rates are so low, and trying to see who are your true peers. And you have to take that into account as well when you look at operating budget, census numbers. And then, touched upon this earlier, just compliance. You really want to adhere to the regulations and standards and make sure you're not, double recovering costs, that you're charging cost-based rates, especially when you have federal projects involved. So additional, operational objectives that can be identified by using the data gathered throughout this process is, we talked a lot about this at the beginning as well, that financial transparency. The rate calculation really is a cornerstone of effective financial management and really helps you to achieve operational excellence in your animal research facility. And this is going to support both the welfare of the animals, your institution's research mission, and ensuring your effective cost recovery. I think when users see that they understand the costs going in and it's not a black box and they have no idea why they're being charged that, they still might not like the rates they're being charged, but it allows them to fully understand, what that is that they're paying for. And lots of times I think the message that comes through, as Neil said too, is that, hey, you really should even be paying higher than what you are. And to see that and have that transparency, we have found to be really helpful when the messaging comes out that there's going to be an increase in per diem rates on campuses. And again, cost recovery, making sure that you're not leaving costs on the table, that you are recovering the actual costs of the animal care, that you are building in all the costs that you can, and then also that you're not duplicating cost recovery. And then looking forward, as we know, you're using that static year, so you're always kind of going to be a year behind. I know we've talked about different approaches to the calculation to try and bridge that gap. But this whole exercise really helps you for budget planning and just to accurately, you can actually project out, as we said, looking at where your rates are. And if you're calculating rates that are 20-30% higher today, and you're only going to be able to increase them 3 to 5%, you can kind of start to project that out, 3, 5, 7 years down the line, and start, that messaging as well. So researchers can have that knowledge going into when they're putting together their budgets and planning, as well as your own facilities. So and then continuing on the additional operational objectives, I know resource allocation, this came up. This is a big piece of the time and motion study, really understanding the true costs of, the animal care. The salaries are going to be the largest expense. And if you really understand, who those individuals are, what are their daily tasks, and that information and the study of the time and motion is really just to appropriately allocate those salaries to those individual species. But there are a lot of other data points that do come out of that, as we've mentioned earlier, just kind of seeing how does that compare, or if you are looking to do benchmarking or talk to a peer institution, how many FTEs do you have working in cage wash versus them? What's the operating budget? Are we allocating resources effectively? Do we think we can, move some around, or do we need, to add to here? That's all going to assist with being able to just adequately support that research mission on campus. Operational efficiency, so cost-based per diem rates. You're going to see where the costs go through. You want to ensure that they are cost-based. And that's really, one of the main goals of this exercise. And you'll see, where are these effectively, where can you identify those costs as well and align them to specific species? And where is it maybe kind of a black box in your own operational expenditures? And what can be done to be better tracking those costs? And is there room to improve or reduce costs? Or are there costs, again, left out on the table that you're not being able to pull in? Compliance, as we've talked about before, and then the benchmarking. And I think just keeping all of these points in mind, it's really easy to go out and look up a species or Google it and see what other institutions are charging. But you really have to, make sure you're aligning, comparing apples to apples. What's the operating budget? When subsidies come into play, you have no idea, what the true rate might be at that facility. And this is also a great message to, your community and the researchers, is that what's being charged and what really the true cost is not always the same. So a quick poll question here. Does your facility get an institutional subsidy? Okay. So appreciate the participation. It does look like the majority is receiving within the last 5 years some sort of a subsidy. Around 16% is not. And then there's a handful of people who also aren't quite sure. So when thinking about the utilization of basically the output and all of the data that goes into the animal per diem rate calculation, when we talk about subsidies, institutions are often subsidizing their per diem rates to recover a portion of the cost associated with animal care. Like we just saw, that might not always be the case, but I'd say more often than not, that is what we are seeing. And so when you think about all of the pieces that go into, again, going back to that transparency and communication, having that clear transparency and communication with researchers about what costs are being in, and then for them to understand what a subsidized rate really is. And so that goes back to the point I was just saying, that maybe, the per diem rate should really be $2 and you're charging 98 cents. Well, there's still costs there, and they're still being covered, and it may not be that you're able to charge that out and be charged to projects, but sometimes there's that disconnect of understanding that really it does still cost this. And so having that communication to your users and that transparency, the financial planning aspect. Offices often review and approve these rates. So are your rates getting approved? This goes back to institutional policies. Are you being held to a standard of, other service center operations on campus? Are you, I know when we've partnered with institutions, they have to go through and calculate these per diem rates and submit them within their institution to have those approved before they can issue any increase or charge those out. Is there any forum or avenue like that exists? And if not, is that something you'd like to think about or implement as well within your institution? And then, subsidized per diem rates are usually covering that routine colony health. So kind of going back to that standard of care, and some specialized services are charged in addition. Typically, you might see that the subsidy is going to be more on that per diem rate than the technical services, but also understanding, which services are being subsidized. If there is one, where is that being applied? So another poll question here: how often does your institutional subsidy change? So this is a pretty good mix of answers. So some are, seeing a change in that subsidy on an annual basis. Some are seeing it maybe as more of an as needed, or every few years. Some have not seen, and that's not uncommon. We do see that. And again, some not 100% sure, if that's being received, and if it is, if it's increasing. And last poll question for the afternoon. Have you ever used data gathered through the rate calculation process to build your case for changes to your subsidy? Okay, again, a good mix. So that's great to see that some have been using this information, because I think anybody that has gone through the exercise or the rate calculation is familiar with seeing that probably what you are charging is really not representative of the cost of your operations. So hopefully today you can walk away from this presentation looking at, maybe things in a little bit of a different lens, or going back to see, okay, so everything we've been talking about, how can some of this, be utilized if you are looking for a subsidy increase? And that's something that we talk a lot about with institutions, or they come with those questions. And, really it has an impact on research. The facility maintenance and upgrades, your facility needs to stay up to be able to provide that standard of care. There's the compliance piece that we've talked about, financial planning when looking at budgets and ahead, and just increasing costs. I know that was a question that came through too. I think that in the last 5 years since COVID, we've seen increases in all costs. We've seen increases in salary costs and expenditures. I know Neil touched upon that a little bit, as well as, how we have learned to factor that in. We always kind of knew that we're a year behind. So like with salary merit increases was an adjustment we were often making, but now we're seeing that we're doing analysis where let's look at the expenditures from the last time the calculation went through, and let's look at where they are today. And in this current fiscal year, because we're going to be using data that's 1 year behind, are we seeing 10% growth? And if that's the case, we feel that we have financial backing to then equate that percentage that then we're going to apply to some of those other expenditures, because we have been seeing such large operating increases. And so again, I just talked about these. I know we're getting close on time, but here's just a little bit more in depth. I mean, really just taking these operating costs and going through the exercise and really understanding, what are those costs? Who are they supporting? What are the species? What are your bread and butter? Is it rodent based? When you look at your census, those are the ones, typically that we're going to see that are there year to year and are not changing, versus some of those one-off species. And really just, taking that overall picture when approaching, your financial planning, again, the increase in costs, using the calculation to demonstrate how efficiently maybe you are even operating in such a lean capacity. And that could be an argument that's made to show other facilities that have the same census as you, but double the staff. So there's a lot of information that can come out of this outside of calculating those cost-based rates. And it really is conversation that we often have, and it's really interesting. And there's a lot of way to slice and dice the data. So I know we just have a few minutes here, but I know that some questions came through, so I want to make sure we get to some of them. And if we don't get to all, like I said in the beginning, we will reach out to provide an answer.
And I've also put up our information here as well, in case you think of a question afterwards that you want us to answer. All right, let's look. We got a couple minutes. I guess one of the first ones, can these slides be made available after the presentation? Yes. And the recording will also be available for you as well. So we'll get those to you. Anybody else see a question? We have 1 minute.
So I can add the Lean Six Sigma certified. I'm not familiar with that. I don't know if Michelle and Neil have seen that. So I don't know that I've seen a direct correlation or benefit for key leaders within a facility, at least through the work that I've done. I don't know if either of you have seen that before. Michelle, do you want to talk about how to account for PTO or personnel costs within the time and motion really quick?
Yes, so we typically treat PTO as, just a standard cost. Um, if they're on vacation, their salary and wages are still going to be in the rate calculation. And vacations are normal for most of the year. So we just kind of, make sure that the time represented for that person is in the calculation. But we do treat paid breaks as general administration time. So like, their lunch breaks or whatever they have that's paid, we count that as general admin.
And then one last question I saw is, who should be part of the per diem development team? And I really do think it ends up being almost, full staff is touched in some manner. Typically, we might be working closely with like a director, an administrator, a lead vet to just, gather the data and get that basic understanding. But then when conducting a time and motion, you're having, if not all, most of the staff participate in that. And then also after that, as Michelle talked about, lots of times we do spend a good amount of time working with supervisors, just to make.
I think we got cut off.
Oh, I was just going to say representative of, the day-to-day operations within those various work groups. So I think I'm going to get muted again. So I'm going to say thank you guys for attending. And like I said, we'll go back through these questions. If we missed any, we'll make sure to reach out and feel free to contact us. Our contact information, as Michelle says here. We appreciate everyone's time.
Yes, thank you all. Have a great day.
Hi, everyone.